Hello, my name is Scott Matthews, and I am the author of the Mist of Doran series, and it's a medieval fantasy novel that's available online. And throughout the years, I've had a lot of history in building, my own worlds, whether it be through, a role-playing game or some sort of other type of game genre, or in the case of Mist of Doran, making a standalone environment for your book. And so the purpose of this really is several people have asked me, how do you design Mists of Caldoran? What was the process that you went through, and what did you need to do to create that kind of a world? And I think it's important to really understand the world that you're writing about or even playing in, because basically it helps breathe life into the story itself. And so to begin, I think the biggest thing is think of it as a blank canvas. The biggest part about the story is the conflict. It's the absolute foundation of any good story. How did it arise? Was it resolved? More importantly, what role did your characters play in the conflict itself? Now, I'm definitely more familiar with fantasy worlds, and one of the things that I've learned through developing a fantasy environment is that the world really allows you the opportunity to immerse your characters in the world itself. It allows you to create conflict organically. It breathes life into the story. It creates believable situations, and more importantly, it actually creates a reason for the conflict. To begin, we're going to go through a lot of the details in building a world. It's actually going to be a pretty long series. We're definitely going to go into the basic principles. We're going to develop a backdrop for your environment and for your story. And more importantly, we're going to discuss ways that you can develop your world and harness all the different aspects of it so that you can really suck your readers in. The analogy that I use whenever talking about building a new world is it's like a puzzle. It's important that you, as the writer or the author, know everything there is about the world. You need to know all the details. You need to know the history, the historical figures, all the geography, even down to the dialect of each individual group. Now, it's important that that's what you know, but it's also important that you don't spend a whole lot of time writing that in your book or discussing those features, in your game or whatever creative endeavor you're working on. Your readers don't necessarily need to know all the things that you do. It's just important that those details they come out over time. It's more of an organic revealing of the world itself and how each individual piece plays a role in the overall story. Back to the puzzle analogy, think of it when you're building a puzzle. What's the first thing you do? You grab all the outside pieces. So you kind of build that framework for the puzzle just as you would build that framework for your world. And then over time, the finer points just start to fill in and things start to make more and more sense to the reader. It starts to make more and more sense to the characters. And so your world becomes kind of a backdrop to the story without becoming the story itself. And as the series goes on, we're definitely going to go into a lot of the more major concepts. We're really going to get down into detail, and how to actually make this a fluid and an organic world. You're going to create your own virtual society. We're even going to get down to the part where creating your own political boundaries, resource requirements, and more importantly, the evolution of the conflict or the reason that your story is, for lack of a better term. And then the beauty of doing it this way is by the time you're done building the world in the way that I'm going to walk you through, is the story and the characters actually develop themselves. You're going to find a lot of storylines and a lot of plot points just kind of inherently grow out of this world making process. So look forward to that. As we begin with this next section, you're going to start to discover the importance of flow and how the environment actually works or interacts with your characters. It's important to look at your setting compared to the larger world. For example, I live in the United States. Obviously, we have our own situations going on right now, but in compared to the world as a whole, it's very small. Think about that. Your world is likely going to be very large, but your story may or may not consume most of that world. However, it's still important to develop a lot of the facets of that world, and so they interact with your story itself. So you're gonna have big events, you're gonna have small events. Some may not be a big deal at all, some might be critical to your story. So you really need to decide where the story is going to begin, and that's how you know what areas of your world that you need to develop more. So to give you an idea of where we're going with this series, we're going to discuss many of these following topics. As far as the setting, we're definitely going to discuss the fantasy setting. That's kind of my forte and something I've worked on most of my career. But we're also going to go into alternate reality worlds if you decide that sci-fi or some sort of futuristic setting is more up your alley. And of course, we're going to go into real world settings. Maybe you want to create an environment or a story that's based on life as it is right now. How do you incorporate events in your world into your story and make it all a seamless transition for your readers? We're also going to go into geography. We're going to discuss all the different types of terrain, how they are different from one another, how they interact with one another, and how each kind of plays a role in the setting that you develop for your readers. We're going to go into the boundaries that each terrain type creates and kind of discuss how those boundaries are important when it comes to conflict. And more importantly, we're going to discuss the resources that those geographical features create. Obviously, there's no mystery that gold or water or any sort of element or mineral is definitely going to play a role in the conflict. So that'll be a pretty key piece. And then we're going to go into the history of your world. We're going to discuss the origins, whether it be, was it gods that created the world? Was it the Titans? Was it some other cataclysmic event? We're going to decide how the world actually came to be. And then we're going to discuss those ancient civilizations that came before your characters and your setting. How did they come about and how did they influence modern day characters? And then we're going to go into a pretty important piece for the fantasy readers, and that's lore. What's the mythology or the ethos or what stories were handed down from generations that may or may not be true, but definitely affect the way that your characters see the world. And then after we do that, we're going to start getting an idea of what society looks like. How does the geography have a role? How does the history have a role? And eventually that becomes the society. And so we're going to discuss the roles of your characters, the roles of the people in those civilizations. We're going to look at social classes and, more importantly, the lifestyles of each and one of those classes. And then I think once we have the society down, that kind of lends itself well to the political development of your world. What are your governments like? What's your legal system? Is there a monetary system in place? Are you kings and queens? Are you dictators? Is it a feudal state? How do the leaders of your world affect the characters on a day-to-day basis? So that'll be pretty important once we get there. And then finally, the big one is going to be conflict. That's where your story becomes a story. That's where all the excitement is. So we're going to discuss the different types of geopolitical conflict. Are there wars? Is it religion? Is there power struggles? There's tons of meat on the bone right here. So this will be a pretty key section once we finally get to that. And the big thing is, once we're done with all these different series, we're going to actually go in and make a world from scratch. We're going to start from the very beginning, building the land masses and the oceans and the sea. And then we're going to go through and steadily add features like mountains, rivers, resources, basically build from the ground up. And once we have the environment in place, we're going to go through and add cultures and cities and kind of start to see how the setting and the landscape of the world actually does affect the people. And so that'll start to lend itself to a lot of the story generation and the organic building of your societies. And then finally, we're going to go and actually see how that conflict is created. We're going to see how the world influences those decisions, how the environment creates its own conflict, and ultimately how your world, even though it's not the story itself, can be a major part of your story. So I hope you like our series. We're going to go through several details, and hopefully this will be a long and lengthy process, but you'll get a lot of information out of it, and I hope we make a world that you can be proud of.